I used to believe the worst thing that could happen to a homeowner was having the cable go out in the middle of the big game or discovering a leaky pipe during the holidays. Turns out, I was wrong, dead wrong. Because I can tell you from firsthand experience, there's something 1,000 times worse. A vindictive homeowners association run amok. And if you think they're just about finding you for tall grass or wrong color shutters, let me share a little secret. My HOA burned my mansion to the ground. Before I dive into that nightmare, let me start by saying I never wanted a mansion. Well, not exactly. Growing up, my family lived paycheck to paycheck. You know that feeling of opening the fridge and finding only yesterday's leftover casserole and a half-empty carton of milk? That was my childhood. So, when I finally made it big, after investing in niche mechanical patents and a few canny real estate flips, I decided I wasn't going to live small ever again. I found a quiet little cul-de-sac in Maple Bridge Estates, a serene community with perfectly trimmed hedges and pristine white fences. To me, it was paradise. I'd heard rumors that Maple Bridge Estates had one of the strictest HOAs in the country. Tall tales, neighbors forced to repaint houses at their own expense if the color was an inch off the standard. A story about a retired couple being fined because their bird feeder attracted non-resident pigeons. I figured it was all exaggeration, urban legend material. Every neighborhood has that one petty neighbor who complains about your mailbox leaning 2 degrees to the left. I thought, how bad can it really be? The day I signed the deed, I discovered that the HOA had a 105-page rulebook. That should have been a clue, but I was too busy celebrating. I spent 9 months supervising construction, a sprawling estate with pristine landscaping, a custom fountain out front, and a garage that could house the collection of vintage cars I'd been saving up for since I was 20. The day I moved in felt like a coronation of sorts. I threw a casual housewarming, my old buddies from high school, a few business partners, some local acquaintances. We got a little loud, but it wasn't anything over the top. At least, that's what I thought until I found the first HOA citation pinned to my front door at sunrise. The complaint? Excessive noise and unauthorized parking on the street. Fine, $1,000 payable in 30 days. That was only the beginning. Within the first week, I received 5 more citations. One for not having the correct shade of ecru on my shutters. I had apparently gone with a color called Sahara Sands instead of the HOA-approved Sandy Beach. One for having a fountain that was too tall. Their bylaws stated a strict maximum of 4 feet, whereas my custom fountain was 4 feet and 5/8 of an inch tall at its peak. The biggest kicker was the complaint about my driveway. It was made of imported granite stone to match the architectural style of the house. But the HOA insisted Maple Bridge Estates only permitted brick or asphalt. They demanded I tear it out. I tried attending a monthly HOA meeting to work things out face-to-face. That's where I first locked eyes with the board president, a woman named Lorraine. She was well into her 60s, wore her hair in an immaculate silver bob, and possessed a stare that could blister paint. I'd seen impressive leaders in my business career, but none like her. She led that meeting the way a field marshal commands troops. Agenda items zipped by in staccato fashion. Every time I raised a question about my multiple citations, she'd curtly point to a number in their massive tome of bylaws, and everyone around the table would nod in silent agreement, as if obeying an invisible conductor. It was eerie. Still, I wasn't ready to fight the entire HOA. I figured, hey, with a bit of tact and compromise, everything would settle. So, I agreed to remove the fountain's top tier to bring it down to regulation height. I repainted the shutters. I even considered ripping out the driveway, but that would cost a fortune. My patience ran thin, but I kept telling myself I'd moved into a beautiful neighborhood, so maybe all these hoops were worth jumping through. Then Lorraine came by, unannounced, while I was hosting a small gathering, just me and a couple of old college friends. She marched right up my front steps, ignoring the fact that I was entertaining guests, and laid out a brand new set of HOA requests. My mailbox, apparently, was half an inch too tall. The flowers in my garden were not consistent with the region's aesthetic. The recycling bins were visible from a street. It was an onslaught of petty criticisms. My friends watched in stunned silence as this woman leaned in and threatened, If you can't abide by our guidelines, Maple Bridge Estates might not be the place for you." Then she marched away, her high heels clicking on the imported granite I'd so carefully chosen. That's when I got my first real taste of the power this HOA held over the community. Neighbors rarely spoke to me, even though I tried to be friendly. Mail kept arriving from the board, each envelope stuffed with more rules I was supposedly breaking. But I never imagined they'd go so far as to deliberately do something destructive. For months, I just assumed they were trying to push me out with fines and harassment. Little did I know, behind closed doors, Lorraine and her cronies were planning to make an example out of me, punishing me for daring to build a life that didn't conform to their every whim. And then it happened. I was out of town at a conference, ironically speaking about conflict resolution in business. My phone buzzed at 2 a.m. with a message from a concerned neighbor who'd seen the flames from across the street. By the time I reached Maple Bridge Estates the next morning, I was met with a nightmare of twisted metal, smoldering wood, and a hazy smell of burnt fabric. My once proud mansion was a charred skeleton. "Electrical issue," the fire marshal told me with a grim face. But it's suspicious. Standing there, ankle deep in soggy ash, I spotted Lorraine among a small crowd of onlookers. She didn't bother hiding the satisfaction in her gaze, like she'd just discovered a stain on her otherwise immaculate blouse, and was eager to clean it up. In that moment, I realized there was more to this electrical issue than chance. And for the first time since I bought the place, I felt raw, unbridled rage. I lost everything I'd built, everything I'd dreamed of owning. A million questions flooded me. How did an HOA have so much power? Why was my mansion the only one that mysteriously caught fire? How was it the fire hydrants just so happened to be blocked by parked cars that night? As the embers cooled, all I wanted to do was strangle the entire board with their own red tape. But I'm not the type to lose my head. No, I'm the type to bide my time, gather resources, and deliver the kind of payback that would make them regret ever crossing my path. Losing my mansion to a suspicious fire turned my life upside down. The insurance company stalled. Big surprise. They didn't want to pay out a single penny without an extensive investigation. I spent my days walking through the charred rubble, looking for anything that might have survived. Scrapbooks, childhood mementos, expensive suits. The flames had devoured them all. It felt like a funeral every time I visited the site, mourning the loss of both my home and my sense of security. Worse than that was the constant whispering in the neighborhood. People glared at me like I was some sort of criminal. In Maple Bridge Estates, the HOA's word was gospel, and Lorraine was the high priestess. I'd overhear neighbors at the community park or the local diner murmuring about how I had brought it on myself, how I refused to respect the rules, how I was a hothead who didn't belong. One man even claimed he saw me intentionally set the fire for the insurance money. The rumor was ridiculous. The remains of my estate were barely worth scrap. The only reason that story spread was because the HOA stoked it. Fear and gossip, those were their favorite weapons. I hired a private investigator, a grizzled ex-cop named Manuel, to look into the fire. Manuel was blunt. Arson is hard to prove without obvious evidence, and the HOA will have covered its tracks. But I'll see what I can dig up. He spent days knocking on doors. Most folks refused to speak to him, clearly terrified of retribution from aboard. One woman, eyes darting nervously, told him she'd noticed strange comings and goings at my house while I was away, but she clammed up the moment he asked for details. My frustration grew. I felt like I was dealing with some clandestine organization that had half the neighborhood in their pocket. Manuel's final report was inconclusive. The cause was indeed electrical, but in a very contrived way. Enough so that any unbiased observer would raise an eyebrow. However, without a direct witness or hard evidence, like camera footage, my case was circumstantial at best. The prospect of a drawn-out legal battle with the HOA loomed, but I knew I'd be dealing with well-connected attorneys. Lorraine, after all, was rumored to have deep ties to a local judge or two. I was furious. But more than that, I was determined not to let these people ruin me. It was at the local library of all places that I got my first spark of inspiration. I was sifting through old real estate records, trying to figure out how Maple Bridge Estates got started and who truly had power over its finances. That's when I learned something interesting about HOAs. Like corporations, they have budgets, financial ledgers, and sometimes they're not as collective as they appear. In fact, some HOAs are structured in a way that a single large investor could potentially buy out debts or foreclosures within the association, thereby gaining influence, sometimes controlling influence, on the board. My heart pounded as I read. It sounded crazy, but I knew from business that hostile takeovers happen all the time. Usually, it's a big fish swallowing a smaller fish. Could I become that big fish? At first, I felt a pang of conscience. Who was I to swoop in and financially gut an HOA? But then I remembered the blackened ruins of my house. I remembered the fear in my neighbor's eyes. This HOA had turned into a monster. And I'm no vigilante hero, but I sure as heck wasn't going to sit back and let them ruin another life or keep me from rebuilding. So I started small. I got my financial team to gather up records of Maple Bridge Estates holdings, any outstanding loans, any pending liens. And oh boy, do we find some skeletons in those neatly manicured closets. Turns out, Maple Bridge Estates was on the brink of major financial trouble. The roads in the development were aging, the community clubhouse needed renovations, and a pending lawsuit, unrelated to my own issues, had put them at risk of bankruptcy. Their emergency fund was almost depleted, and the only way to cover upcoming expenses was to raise HOA dues yet again. That news was guaranteed to enrage the average homeowner, even the ones who thought Lorraine walked on water. Here's where it got really interesting. The association had taken out a large loan to fund the initial construction of a new golf course that never quite got off the ground. Due to years of mismanagement and Lorraine's penchant for grand designs that never materialized, the HOA was responsible for paying off that debt. They had, in essence, borrowed more money than they could feasibly pay back, banking on increased property values that never arrived because prospective buyers were intimidated by the HOA's reputation. Suddenly, Maple Bridge Estates was more fragile than it appeared. That vulnerability made me grin. Because if there's one thing I understood from my years in business, it's that if you want real leverage, you find fault lines in your opponent's finances. After some serious number crunching and legal consultations, we discovered we could buy up the debt from the original lenders, effectively becoming the HOA's largest creditor. Of course, that would require a hefty chunk of my personal fortune. But considering everything I'd already lost and the fiery injustice done to me, it felt like a righteous gamble. If I became the HOA's creditor, I could make demands that the board wouldn't be able to refuse. Even better, I could position myself to take control of Maple Bridge Estates entirely. You might call it a scorched earth policy, but seeing as they'd literally scorched my earth already, I felt no sympathy. I started the process quietly. My attorneys made inquiries. My financial advisors set up shell corporations. We kept everything under wraps, because if Lorraine caught a whiff of my plan, she'd rally the board to block me. My closest confidants asked me if I was sure about this, if I really wanted to become the villain in this twisted piece of suburban drama. My answer never wavered. They burned me down. I'm only returning the favor by hitting them where it hurts, their checkbook. Meanwhile, I made sure to act subdued around Maple Bridge Estates, playing the part of the grieving homeowner who might never recover. I heard through the grapevine that Lorraine was telling everyone I'd finally been put in my place and was considering moving away. If only she knew the storm that was brewing behind the scenes. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. Then came a day I closed the deal. By midnight, I had quietly acquired the HOA's debt. In other words, Maple Bridge Estates now owed me, personally, a staggering sum of money they couldn't repay. I was their largest creditor and had a binding legal right to a seat at their table. More than that, I had the power to demand radical changes to their leadership structure. The best part, not a single soul on the HOA board saw it coming. To them, I was just that out-of-place mansion owner, the troublemaker who dared to install a tall fountain. They didn't know they were one board meeting away from being blindsided. As I stared at the signed documents on my desk, adrenaline pumping, I realized this was only the beginning. Buying the debt was my foot in the door. Taking control would be trickier, requiring strategic manipulation of bylaws, membership votes, and a fair bit of political theater. But I was prepared. After losing everything I owned, I had learned that caution only takes you so far in life. Sometimes you have to go for the jugular. The next Maple Bridge Estates board meeting took place in a lavishly decorated community center, a building that ironically still flaunted a appealing paint job despite the HOA's obsession with appearances. I arrived unannounced and quiet, blending in with neighbors who were there to protest a hike in dues. The crowd was unusually large, and tension crackled in the air. It seemed Lorraine had scheduled a special vote to increase monthly fees by 25%, a staggering number that would strangle folks on fixed incomes. People were angry. Whispers circulated about how Lorraine's mismanagement had driven them to this point. I took a seat in the back, arms folded, listening to the gripes and complaints roll in. One retired gentleman with a tremor in his voice said, "I've been living here for 20 years, and I can't afford another dollar. How is this fair?" Lorraine, all too calmly, explained that the community was facing financial headwinds and that she appreciated his concerns. The condescension in her tone lit a fire in my gut. This was the same woman who'd smirked at my destroyed home, the same tyrant who had turned decent people into anxious recluses. I allowed myself a grim little smile. In about 20 minutes, I intended to shatter her carefully orchestrated facade. When public comments ended, Lorraine cleared her throat. "All right, let's move on to the vote. We'll need a 2/3 majority from the board to pass the increased dues." She raised her gavel, ignoring the sea of worried faces. Before she could bring it down, I stood up. "I have a motion to add to the agenda," I announced, my voice echoing in the silent hall. Heads swiveled in my direction. A murmur spread. Most people recognized me as the guy with the giant mansion that had gone up in flames. Lorraine tried to force a polite smile, but her lips twitched with annoyance. "This meeting is for association members only, Mr." She paused, clearly hoping I'd slink away. "I'm a member," I declared, stepping toward the front. "And not only that, I happen to own your debt." Gasps and whispers erupted. Several board members exchanged alarmed glances. Lorraine's face turned paper white, then flushed an angry red. You own the debt," she spluttered. "This is outrageous. We took out that loan with Maple Bridge Lending, which sold it to a consortium I cut in, which sold it again, until it reached me. In short, Maple Bridge Estates owes me tens of millions, and I'm prepared to call on that debt if this board doesn't meet certain conditions." I paused, letting the gravity sink in. Eyes widened. Some in the audience seemed delighted at the spectacle. Others looked terrified. Lorraine's voice quavered. "You can't bully us like this. We have a strict process. We have bylaws." "Oh, I'm well aware of your bylaws, Lorraine," I said, stepping closer to the table where the board members sat. I flipped open a binder I'd brought along. In fact, I've spent considerable time studying them. According to Section 12, Article 4, the largest secured creditor has the right to request emergency board seats to protect their financial interests. I tapped the page with emphasis. "That means you're looking at your newest board member. So yes, I'm here to vote on the matter of dues and everything else." For a moment, she was struck mute. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Then one of the other board members, a scrawny man named Arthur, fidgeted with his tie and squeaked, "We can't just allow." "We can," interrupted a second board member, her eyes darting nervously. "It's in the bylaws, just like he said." Clearly, she'd read them, too. Lorraine's gavel trembled in her hand. "Fine," she spat, "but you get one vote. You can't just waltz in here and override the entire board." She straightened her shoulders, trying to regain control. "Now, all those in favor of raising the monthly dues by 25%, please indicate with a show of hands." She promptly raised hers, glaring around as if daring people to defy her. Arthur and another board member followed suit, though less confidently. Two others kept their hands down, likely nervous about the angry crowd. Lorraine's face remained impassive. "That's 3 out of 5. Enough for a majority." She shot me a triumphant look. "Your vote can't stop this, dear. Majority, yes, but not 2/3. I calmly explained. You have 5 board members. 2/3 of 5 is more than 3. You need 4 votes to pass this measure. I gave her a pointed smile and raised my voice for everyone to hear. I vote no. Cheers erupted from the neighbors. Lorraine's face contorted in fury, but she could only sputter. The motion failed. For the first time in Maple Bridge Estates history, an HOA board measure had been killed publicly. Residents with tears in their eyes thanked me, while others stood in stunned disbelief. Lorraine slammed her gavel down, calling for order, but I could see the cracks forming in her facade. I wasn't done. Given the precarious financial situation, I continued, I move we have an immediate vote on new board leadership. Per your bylaws, emergency elections can be triggered if the association's finances are at risk. And since I'm your biggest creditor, I believe finances are definitely at risk. Another ripple of excited conversation spread through the audience. Lorraine stared daggers at me. This is ridiculous. The board's term isn't up for another 6 months. We have scheduled elections. Yes, in 6 months, by which time you plan to bleed these people dry with special assessments. I retorted. If the association defaults on its debt, my debt, do you know what happens? The entire neighborhood is at risk of foreclosure. Every homeowner could see their property values plummet. I turned to the crowd. Folks, I'm not here to raise your dues. I'm here to stop the destructive leadership that led us to this brink. It was a carefully orchestrated move. I'd done my homework, rummaged through the old rulebook, and discovered a loophole that said if the HOA solvency is compromised, the membership could call for a vote of no confidence and force new leadership. The membership in the room was more than ready. They'd had enough of Lorraine's tyranny. When I put forth the motion for a no-confidence vote, there was an overwhelming chorus of ayes. Lorraine's face might have melted steel. She brandished her gavel so hard I thought it might snap. This is an outrage. I demand a recess, she shrieked. But the other board members were already caving under the pressure of the angry, cheering neighbors. One by one, they turned against her, acknowledging that an emergency leadership vote was valid. Within minutes, Lorraine was faced with the unthinkable. The real possibility that her reign as president was about to end right there, in front of everyone she'd lorded over for years. We set the vote by ballot, and Maple Bridge Estates members lined up. While people filled out their slips, Lorraine cornered me, eyes aflame. You think you're clever, don't you? You won't last a week in my position. I'll find a way to bury you. I met her glare, unflinching. You already tried burying me. You burned my house to the ground. But guess what, Lorraine? I'm still here, and I'm ready for round 2. She cursed under her breath, turning away to huddle with her diminishing circle of supporters. When the ballots were tallied, it wasn't even close. Lorraine and her loyal minions were tossed out of office. A new interim board was formed, a coalition of disgruntled homeowners who wanted to see accountability. As the largest creditor, I was guaranteed a seat with voting power over major financial decisions. Lorraine looked shell-shocked, like someone who'd woken up to find her life's work undone in a single night. As she stormed out, I couldn't help but feel a thrill of triumph. Yet, in the back of my mind, I knew my real plan, purchasing the entire HOA, had only just begun. Dethroning Lorraine was a big step, but if I wanted true, lasting authority here, I needed to buy up property as well, or utilize the existing debt structure to foreclose on those who'd assisted in destroying my home. Because, oh yes, I planned to evict every last board member who'd played a part in my misery. I wanted them gone, not just from power, but from Maple Bridge Estates. The question was how far I'd be willing to go. The morning after the board meeting, I took a symbolic walk around the neighborhood. It was the first time since the fire that I strolled Maple Bridge Estates without a knot of dread in my stomach. The manicured lawns, the pastel houses with carefully regulated facades, even the old oak trees that lined the streets. It all looked different, as though a fog had lifted. Most residents greeted me with gratitude. "Thank you for blocking the dues increase," said a retired couple who actually invited me in for coffee. Another man, watery-eyed, confessed he'd been too frightened to oppose Lorraine in the past. I realized something. The people here weren't my enemy. They were stuck in a system that had turned oppressive. There was a real sense of relief in the air, like survivors after a storm. Still, I couldn't forget the charred wreckage of my mansion, nor could I forgive those directly involved in that travesty. I delved into the HOA's records, and with my new position on the interim board, I had access to everything. Emails, financial statements, private notes among board members. Unsurprisingly, I found unsavory evidence that a few key people, Lorraine and her inner circle, had manipulated rules for personal gain. They'd forced homeowners to contract only with preferred vendors who paid kickbacks to the board. They'd authorized suspicious fines, some of which were never recorded officially but ended up in certain board members' pockets. Most enraging were the cryptic references to my property. Multiple emails indicated that my mansion was considered a problem that had to be resolved. Nothing outright stated, "Let's torch the place," but the insinuation was clear. They wanted me gone by any means. My jaw tightened as I read. Shortly after, I learned that Lorraine owned 3 properties in Maple Bridge Estates under shell corporations, rentals she used to funnel money. Her cohorts had 2 more. Armed with this information, I turned to my lawyers. Thanks to the debt obligations I now controlled, I could basically call in the notes on any property that had fallen behind on HOA dues or had special assessments pending. Combine that with evidence of misconduct, and I had a legal wedge to force them out. Nothing made me prouder than signing off on those foreclosure notices. It felt cold, maybe even heartless. But I reminded myself, these were the same people who'd orchestrated an arson that destroyed my home and nearly ruined my life. I was done playing a nice guy. The day the eviction notices went out was surprisingly anticlimactic. Lorraine's stooges tried to protest, but they quickly discovered that without the board to shield them, their web of shady deals unraveled. They had no allies left. Many moved out quietly, slipping away before facing public humiliation. However, Lorraine was a different story. She didn't leave politely. The night she got her notice, she stood outside my mansion's debris, still awaiting reconstruction, shouting curses at the top of her lungs. If anyone else had done that, I might have called the police, but I walked out to meet her. "You won't get away with this," she hissed. Her makeup was smudged, and she wore bedroom slippers. She looked unhinged, a far cry from the regal presence she once exuded. "You've got 30 days to vacate your properties," I replied evenly, "or I'll have the authorities remove you." She glared at the blackened remains of my house. "People like you, rich bullies, you think you can buy anything you want. That's ironic, coming from someone who tried to rule this neighborhood by fear," I said, stepping closer so she could see the resolve in my eyes. "I didn't set out to become the big bad guy. You made me into one when you torched my home. Did you really think I'd slink away without fighting back?" She flung a handful of ashes at my feet, ashes from my own front yard. "This isn't over," she promised, her voice shaking with rage. Then she stomped back to her car. I watched her peel out of the cul-de-sac, the taillights disappearing into the quiet streets she once controlled. Strangely enough, I felt no victory in that moment, just a sense of finality. The weeks that followed were busy. I negotiated a favorable settlement with the rest of the HOA, deferring some of their debt so that regular homeowners wouldn't be crushed by higher dues. We hammered out a plan to rebuild the roads and fix the neglected community center. Meanwhile, I launched a reconstruction project for my own mansion. This time, though, I decided to scale back. I didn't need a sprawling estate that screamed wealth. I wanted a comfortable home, something that wouldn't make me a target for petty dictators. I'd keep the granite driveway, call it my last vestige of pride, but the fountain would remain modest in compliance with local codes. I'd already proved my point. I could break the tyrants if they pushed me too far. And so, one sunny afternoon, I found myself standing on a half-finished foundation, looking out over Maple Bridge Estates. The contractors hammered and drilled around me, framing what would eventually be my new living room. I could see neighbors walking dogs, kids playing on the sidewalk. The tension that once hung in the air had lifted. I took a deep breath, feeling an unfamiliar but welcome sensation, peace. A soft voice behind me said, "Nice view." I turned to see one of my new fellow board members, a middle-aged guy named Robert, who'd been instrumental in ousting Lorraine. "We appreciate what you did," he said, lowering his voice so the workers wouldn't overhear. "You stopped the dues increase and clean house. You practically saved this neighborhood." I shrugged, still somewhat conflicted about my methods. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just didn't want them to hurt anyone else like they hurt me. He nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes that's how heroes are made. With that, he walked away, leaving me to wrestle with the idea. The final eviction of Lorraine happened at dawn one Friday. A county sheriff arrived with papers, ready to escort her off the property. She had a meltdown on the front lawn, screaming about how Maple Bridge Estates belonged to her and how I'd set her up. But the sheriff was unimpressed with her rant. She left with a few suitcases, her face pale and stunned, and that was that. I heard she moved in with a relative across town. Maybe she'd plot revenge in some dingy basement, or maybe she'd finally realize her reign was over. Not long after, I petitioned for a full membership vote to officially adopt a more balanced leadership structure. The motion passed. Term limits were introduced, transparency measures put in place. No single president or cabal could ever again hold the community hostage. I didn't remain on the board. After ensuring the changes were made, I stepped down, figuring I'd done my part. Besides, running an HOA was the last thing I wanted to do with my time. All I wanted was to restore my home and enjoy a quiet life. And ironically enough, Maple Bridge Estates, once a battlefield, was slowly becoming the idyllic place it was always supposed to be. When the construction crew finally packed up, I hosted a small housewarming in the new version of my home. Nothing fancy, just a barbecue with neighbors and friends, including some who'd once been too scared to even say hello. We laughed, we shared stories, we toasted marshmallows over a fire pit. It felt like a scene from a television commercial for suburban bliss, but for the first time, it wasn't a lie or a forced facade. We were a neighborhood, united by hardship, stronger for what we'd overcome. As dusk settled, I stood by the new fountain, regulation height, I might add, and felt a gentle spray of water on my fingertips. The memories of my mansion's burning were still there, seared in my mind, but so was the knowledge that I hadn't let that ruin my life. I fought back. In the process, I discovered that real power isn't about controlling others through fear. It's about using the tools at your disposal, money, law, influence, to protect what's yours and stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. That's a lesson Lorraine never learned. I looked out across my yard, the sun dipping behind the rooftops of Maple Bridge Estates. There was a time I thought I could buy happiness with a big house. But I realized contentment was simpler. It was the sense of belonging and peace I felt right now, knowing nobody could take it away. My new home might not be quite as grand as the one that burned down, but it was mine, free from intimidation and tyranny. Some say revenge never truly satisfies. Maybe that's partly true. Destroying Lorraine's world didn't bring back my old home or erase the trauma, but did give me closure. It made Maple Bridge Estates a better place for the honest folks who live here, and it ensured that no one will ever burn me out of my home again. Because if they try, I'll be ready. After all, I own this HOA, or at least enough of it to keep the reign of terror at bay. And that, my friends, is a home that no flame can destroy. The end.